"They are witches!" screamed John Richardson from his wheelchair. "Every one of them!" There was nothing wrong between my wife and my brother-in-law. We were all just a little family. They've driven her away from me for good. Welcome to the story of the Vigilante Girls. These ladies were so proud of themselves that they posed for this picture. John Richardson lived with his lovely wife Elizabeth. He was a dry goods merchant in the town of Volo, Illinois. The person who can tell the story best is Elizabeth Richardson. This is her story. "Jealousy! Jealousy!" screamed Elizabeth. "Those terrible women attacked me, insulted me, and drove me out of town because they are jealous and narrow-minded. They lie. I am not as they say. I love my husband. He will bear me out in my statement." Her paralytic husband not long before had dictated a statement. He sat helpless in his wheelchair, declaring his absolute faith in his wife's character and conduct, while dozens of her sex pointed the finger of shame and scandal at her. "I kept a good home," she went on. "I took care of my crippled husband and kept my house clean. There is a saloon near our home that we have opposed. These women are wives of men who frequent that place. They listened to their husbands' gossip and were incited to attack me. It is spite work, cruel and inhuman. They say that my actions with my brother-in-law, Will Dunnell, are what caused them to do this. They say that I went buggy riding with him and left my helpless husband alone. It is a cruel lie. I made 2 trips to McHenry, Illinois in a wagon to get furniture. He is my brother-in-law, and he went with me to help me. All these women had to do is to go to card parties and gossip. I refuse to attend their parties because they talk about everyone who tries to be decent. That did not seem to suit them. They know that I love my husband, and he knows it." Elizabeth was asked if she would return to Volo, and she said, "No, never. I could not do it. They were so mean to me. It was a terrible place. I'm going away and start over. I will ask my husband to come with me. I know he will. I know he understands. He is a good man." She had fled to Chicago to be with her sister when she told her story. Rumor has it that Dunnell, the brother-in-law, had fled to England. Her lips trembled, and her fingers nervously rolled a handkerchief into a ball as she talked almost in whispers. "I had just returned from the railway station where I had taken my aged mother. She was going to Palatine, Illinois. I was in the dining room when I heard a rap on the door. I opened it. Mrs. Peter Stadfelt, she is our blacksmith's wife, stood before me. So jealous were my neighbors and so peculiar had been their attitude that I had long expected they would do something to injure me, not physically, but in a way that would destroy my peace of mind. But as I saw Mrs. Stadfelt standing in the doorway, something told me that drastic means were to be used." Mrs. Richardson wiped the tears from her eyes as she collected herself. "Mrs. Stadfelt's an athletic woman, one who you would fear if you thought she had a grudge against you. She grabbed my arms and dragged me outside the house. I asked her what she intended to do, but she said not a word. Just around the corner of my house, I came face to face with about 15 women. They leered at me and then began tearing off part of my clothes. My screams were proved unavailing. No one came to my aid. One of their number brought forth the rail. Quickly I became aware of what they intended to do to me. I had heard of such cruel treatment before. As they lifted me on the rail, I yelled at the top of my voice. The only answer I got was the jeers. They screamed in union, as if to drown out my cries. Along the road for a quarter of a mile, I suffered misery, the like of which I trust no woman will ever have to endure. Along the way sat the men of the village. I appealed to them in vain. They did not help the women, nor did they raise a finger to stay the shameful scene. Then appeared Clara Rostoucher. She is 17 years old, a girl with a heart that is human. She pleaded with those who were torturing me, but in vain. Someone told her to keep still, or they would ride her on a rail. Then she stopped. As I slid from side to side on the rail, the women laughed in delight at my discomfiture. So did men and boys who followed the procession. Just a quarter of a mile from my home, there's a partly dried up pond. The women headed toward this. I divined their intention and almost swooned. The indignities they were heaping upon me were terrible. Bringing the rail up to the edge of the pond, they jerked it back and forth until I fell off. As I lay in the mire, they kicked at me and pelted me with handfuls of mud. Then one of their number told me to get out of town in 24 hours, or they would apply a coat of tar to me. Here's what Elizabeth's sister said about her life. For 9 years, Elizabeth has attended her husband like a child. She has conducted his store, done all the household work, and lifted all the worries from his shoulders. He was always nagging her. On July 4, my sister came to me and said she couldn't stand it any longer, that she was going to get a divorce. I begged her for the sake of our 82-year-old mother not to separate. She went back to her husband a nervous wreck, but determined to stick by him. And now those women heap this indignity on her. John Richardson mortgaged his property and gave Elizabeth the money to leave Volo. He said, "There will be no divorce. I don't know what we can do now. My wife doesn't dare come back. She is afraid for her life. I can't leave Volo because my store is my only means of livelihood. I am going to try to get warrants for the arrest of the ringleaders of the band who attacked my wife. It seems someone should suffer for all this unhappiness that has been brought upon us. And to think I was helpless to save her from the indignities which were heaped upon her. Her clothing was half torn from her, and amid jeers and cheers and the throwing of mud and stones, she was ridden through the streets. From left to right the women are Mrs. Albert Miller, Mrs. George Bohr, Mrs. H.A. Raymond, Mrs. John Walton, Mrs. Peter Stadfeld, Mrs. Chris Sable, Mrs. John Stadfeld, and Mrs. Jack Frost. The group of women were proud of themselves and stood by their statement that if Elizabeth would not have left town, they would have tarred and feathered her the next day. The men who watched the degradation stated that they were proud of the women, and they would have joined in the tar and feathering if Elizabeth would not have left town. Mrs. Dunnell, Elizabeth's sister-in-law, was one of the leaders in the whole affair. She stated that there was domestic trouble in their home due to Mrs. Elizabeth Richardson. Mrs. Dunnell states that she does not expect her husband to ever return to Volo either. The women denied being jealous of her and pelting her with mud and sticks. Before Elizabeth left her sister's home in Chicago, she said, "To think that kind of people did it. They are not representative of women, but are the lower element of the town. The real people of Volo will stand by me. One woman who was in the rail party owes me $125. I have seen the husband of one of the other women slap his wife in a public dance hall. Another woman is constantly beaten by her drunken husband. I could go through the list and tell you something like that about every one of the women. And to think that it is the kind of women who subjected me to such cruelty. That is the worst of it. I have no shame because I know I am innocent." On December 4th, 1913, just a few months later, 6 of the women were on trial for their part in the rail ride. Elizabeth was there next to her husband, who, with the assistance of a stout stick, hobbled from her side to the witness chair and told his story. It was a simple story of love and trust and loyalty. There was neither malice nor resentment in it. He said they were happy together, and his wife was pretty and dressed well, and that is why the women gossiped and attacked her. John Richardson had lost business in his general store. He stated that some days he only makes $1.50, so he will move away soon. His had been the only general store in town, but another man named Stoffel opened another store near his, and people are shopping there. 5 of the 6 women on trial were found guilty of rioting. 4 of the women were over 58 years old, and only one was 25. All of the 5 were grandmothers. except for the captain, Emma Stadfeld. Elizabeth smiled through her tears when the verdict of the jury was read. She walked to the jury box and shook the hands of each juror in simple appreciation. Emma Stadfeld, the captain, smiled disdainfully and strode from the room, saying the verdict was an outrage. I must interject something here. 2 of the women wore black masks, and their identities were a mystery to the mob. I believe they were men dressed as women to help carry the rail. The majority of the women were too old to carry the weight of the rail, and I'm sure they knew exactly who the men were. The penalty for the women was $200 or 6 months in jail. Elizabeth had a civil suit of $100,000 pending against the women. Dunnell was married to John Richardson's sister. He took off after Elizabeth was attacked. It was said he was under the impression that a similar fate awaited him. Supposedly, no one knew where he was, not even his wife and 2 children. But after the trial and the women were fined, he came back and was seen at Round Lake, a town near Volo. He admitted that he was offered $500 to say he had been away with Elizabeth the entire time that he was missing. He says that it was not true and he would not make the claim. It seems that he was in contact with his wife because he knew exactly where to be seen at Round Lake with his family. He says they will not return to Volo. Rose and Dunnell were divorced December 1914. Elizabeth remained in Chicago with her sister. John Richardson attempted to auction off his property but had to call off the sale. He said his stock was being let go far too cheap. He sold the remainder of the stock at a private sale and hopes to start a business in the outskirts of Chicago. John and Elizabeth had reconciled, but the business in Chicago was a bust. January 15, the suit for damages began. Elizabeth sued the 6 women for $100,000, and Mrs. Dunnell was suing Elizabeth for $25,000 in her divorce suit for alienation of affection. She was pressured by the 6 women being sued for the $100,000. She told Elizabeth that if she dropped the suit against the women, that she would drop her suit for $25,000. The trial regurgitated the rail ride, and accusations flew on both sides. And by the way, Dunnell and his wife had reconciled for a short time, and then he took off again. So he was not present for any of the court proceedings. Finally, on January 16, 1915, the court awarded Elizabeth $3,500 damages against the 6 women, and that was found to be excessive, so the amount was cut to $1,500, and she promised to put them in jail if they failed to pay. The women asked that the case be appealed to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court of the United States if necessary. In the meantime, Mrs. Raymond died, and her estate was being sued for the money. The attorney for her estate appealed. Her sister-in-law, Mrs. Dunnell, proceeded to sue Elizabeth for $25,000 for alienation of affection. 8 months later, the following November, John Richardson had plans to open a 5 and 10 cent store in a town just 7 miles from Volo. To sum it up, by 1919, 7 years after the famous rail ride, Elizabeth was still living in Chicago, separated from her husband but not divorced. Her health had been bad since the rail ride. She had chronic neck problems. The estate of Mrs. Raymond paid the entire amount of the settlement of the lawsuit against the 6 women. The amount that was finally paid was $1,742.50. Mrs. Raymond's estate was charged because the others in the lawsuit were unable to pay. The Dunnell suit against Elizabeth was dropped because his affections weren't anywhere worth $25,000. Mrs. Dunnell continued to live happily in Volo. I don't know about you, but I think the whole idea of public shaming is a bad idea. Gossip and Mrs. Dunnell herself stirred up the mob, and also there was an argument in the town Elizabeth and John opposed the saloon near their home. That saloon was frequented by the husbands of the women who shamed her. Also, Elizabeth was very nice looking and dressed well compared to the women who drove her out of town. So just maybe, all of this was about jealousy and shutting down the general store. I was surprised how self-righteous the mob was. I hope you enjoyed the story. Subscribe for more. Thanks for listening. Bye.